Welcome back to Gothic Homemaking. It may be a scorching summer here in New York City, but every day is Halloween at the Lair of Voltaire. And recently, I found something at the local supermarket that made me feel like autumn was invading summertime. And that's this crazy vegetable. Well, apparently it's called an acorn squash, and they come in green or yellowish orange like a pumpkin, or a combination of those colors. I'm told the color doesn't affect the flavor at all, which is sort of nutty and a little bit sweet like a pumpkin. Of course, I chose an orange one because I'm trying to bring October vibes to the Lair of Voltaire. And to that end, I was determined to cook this thing. And I have to tell you, it went much better than expected. Take a look. For starters, I pulled out a cutting board. This is my Halloween moon design from my Society 6 store. Next we'll be needing a sharp knife and, of course, our acorn squash. The skin is edible, so I gave it a good wash before I began. The first thing I'm going to do is cut off the top. Then I'm going to cut off the bottom. Next I'm going to flip it over and cut it in half. Now, as you can see, the inside is full of seeds, and you can roast these seeds just like you would pumpkin seeds. Let me get one of these out of the way for a moment and bring in a nice spooky spiderweb bowl. And then with my skeletal spoon, I'm going to get all of these seeds out of here. Now, I'm not going to worry about roasting the seeds this time around, so let me just get this out of the way for now. That leaves us with these two halves. And next, I'm going to put these on a baking tray. I'm using pieces of the top that I cut off to wedge under each half to keep them good and level. Now, let's talk about this recipe. Now, as I mentioned, I have never cooked acorn squash before. I've never even tried it. Wow, it seems like there's a storm blowing in. Well, we're just going to keep right on shooting. It'll only enhance the mood. In any case, I did a little research. I looked around on the internet. I found that most recipes for roasted acorn squash involved using salt, pepper, some spices, butter, and something sweet like maple syrup or brown sugar. So I just put all of that information together and I prepared what's more or less a typical roasted acorn squash recipe. Take a look. For starters, we're going to use some salt. I'm not going to be shy about how much salt I put on these. Next up is pepper. You can use pre-ground pepper, but I like to grind it myself for a fresher taste. Next, we're going to use cinnamon. Oops, that's quite a bit. It's a bit hard to get just the right amount on there. That looks pretty good. Next up is my favorite, nutmeg. But first, it's time for our creepy trivia. This little nut is nutmeg. During the Middle Ages, it was believed to cure the plague, so it was extremely valuable, but scarce. So scarce, in fact, that it is said that a bag of these nuts... Don't interrupt my creepy trivia with your filth, fool! Anyway, it was said that a bag of nutmeg would buy you a house. The only thing is that in Europe at the time, the only people who knew where nutmeg grew were Arab merchants. Well, eventually the Europeans found out that nutmeg only grew on a small collection of islands in Indonesia called the Banda Islands. And once they had that knowledge, the race was on to corner the international nutmeg trade. Well, the Dutch in particular were very keen on establishing a worldwide monopoly on nutmeg. So when the Dutch finally reached the Banda Islands, they informed the indigenous people that they were not to sell the nutmeg that they harvested to the English, the Portuguese, or to any of their other trading partners. The locals had a difference of opinion, so the Dutch killed 90% of the population, and they replaced them with slaves that they mostly stole from Portuguese slaving vessels that they'd encountered on the high seas. It is hard to believe that this little nut that gives our food that sweet, wonderful, Christmassy flavor was once the cause of an actual genocide.
Wait, what?
Yeah, Let's switch the topic to something sweeter, shall we? Next up, we'll be using some brown sugar. Some recipes call for maple syrup instead, but I'm not a fan, so I'll use brown sugar. And like the salt, I am not going to be at all shy about how much I use. I'm going for decadently delicious. And lastly, we'll need some butter. As you can see, I'm not really much for measuring. I just eyeball it. But I'd say this is roughly like a quarter of a stick in each half. And now they're ready to go. Of course, I'm going to clean up this mess before I put them in the oven, but I'll do that in the kitchen. Now my tray is cleaned, and I've preheated the oven to 350 degrees, and in they go. 20 minutes later, I pulled them out. At this point, you can use a spoon to drip this delicious melted butter over the top and the sides of the squash to baste them in deliciousness. And then it's back in the oven. About 25 minutes later, I pulled them out and saw that they were done by gently stabbing them with a fork. To serve them, I cut each piece in half and transfer each piece onto a spooky plate. There you have it. Move over, candied yams. There is a new sweet and delicious side dish in town. The butter has melted. The sugar is practically caramelized. Let me tell you something. If you have little monsters at home who don't like vegetables, I can almost guarantee you they're gonna love this one. Hell, it's practically dessert. And since it's practically dessert, why not take it all the way and make it a la mode? I'm using the classic vanilla ice cream, but you can use any flavor you fancy. Wow, that looks so good. And you know what would make it even better? No, stupid! More freshly ground nutmeg. But first, another bit of trivia. We're here on the island of Manhattan, which was once a Dutch colony called New Amsterdam. Now, I was always under the impression that the Dutch sold Manhattan to the English, but I recently discovered that I was wrong. They didn't sell it. They traded it. And what did they trade the island of Manhattan for? They traded it for a tiny little island in Indonesia, the last of the Banda Islands that the Dutch didn't already possess. So this multi-trillion-dollar island that I live on was given to the English for the last piece of the puzzle the Dutch needed to have a total worldwide monopoly on. These nuts! Let's take another look at that delicious roasted acorn squash dish again. There you have it, a more or less classic and sweet way of preparing acorn squash. Next, I got inspired to create a savory dish using acorn squash, and I came up with a recipe of my own, and this is where things get really crazy. Take a look. I think this time I'll use my Murder She Crowed cutting board, also from my Society 6 store. It all begins the same way, with an acorn squash and a very sharp knife. Once again, I'm going to cut off the bottom and cut off the top and split it in half and empty out all of the seeds. I place them onto a baking pan. Again, we start with salt. And ground pepper. And butter. Now, some people like to add a little curry powder or some cayenne pepper if you like your food spicy, but I'm going to leave my squash just like this. The real magic of my recipe is going to be in the sauce. And for that, I'm going to dice half of an onion. And I'll be using about 1.5 to 2 red bell peppers. I cut those in half, and I remove all of the seeds and pulp, and I dice those as well. Next is garlic. Now, I'm crazy about garlic, and I typically use more garlic than is really reasonable, and this recipe is no exception. I'm using 4 or 5 unusually large cloves. An easy way to peel these is to first cut off the stem, then just press down on the clove with the side of your knife, and that should make the skin just fall away and make it very easy to peel. Then I chop those up as well. Next, I'm using pistachios. I'm going to chop them up into smaller pieces. These are going to be part of my garnish. And because I'm nuts, I'm also using walnuts. I'll chop these up as well, but I want these in somewhat larger pieces. And now we're ready to cook. I put a large pan on the fire and added a bit of olive oil. Next, I toss in my onions, as well as my garlic. I decided not to be a complete freak and not use all of the garlic I'd cut for this recipe. Next up, I tossed in my diced bell pepper. Next, I added a healthy amount of salt, or should I say an unhealthy amount of salt. And ground pepper as well. I found these coriander seeds in my cabinet, and I thought they'd add a nice little flavor surprise, so I added some of those. Then in went the nuts. And I'm constantly stirring to make sure I evenly distribute all of the salt and the pepper. Next, I added some dried cranberries. I wanted to use fresh ones, but I couldn't find any anywhere. And next, I'm going to use nutmeg. But first, some more nutmeg trivia. Nutmeg may not cure the Black Death, but it is believed to be a powerful antidepressant and an enhancer of creativity. Maybe that's why it makes me so happy when I taste it. Eaten in large doses, it can also have hallucinogenic and mind-altering effects on the level of LSD that lasts for 2 days. If that sounds like fun to you, keep in mind that the high can also come with nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and sometimes even death. So I wouldn't recommend it. Ignore him. Back to the recipe. In goes a pinch of freshly ground nutmeg. Okay, that's actually quite a lot. Now I add some soy sauce and stir that all together. And now we're ready for these gorgeous shiitake mushrooms. This is Havana Club rum. Like all Cuban rums, it is illegal in the United States of America, though that's going to have to be a piece of trivia for a different episode. I do like to add a bit of rum, any rum will do, or even wine to a sauce. You do not have to add alcohol to your sauce if you do not want to, but I do find that it adds a certain depth to the flavor. Next, I added some cranberry sauce. You can use the jellied variety, or if you use the sauce that has whole berries, you can probably skip the dried cranberries altogether. I added about 2 heaping tablespoons of the cranberry sauce. And I really want to mash that in there and get it all liquefied. And that's it. Wow, just look at that rich, delicious decadence. Let's move this for a moment. Now we can bring in our acorn squash that's been baking for 20 minutes. And once again, we can use a spoon to distribute the butter to all of the surfaces. After baking for another 25 minutes, I check to make sure the squash is nice and tender. I think that's ready to go. To serve, I cut each piece in half, and if the sauce has cooled down, I might want to heat that back up before plating it onto this nice spooky dish. Look at that. It's just marvelous. Oh, I wish you could smell this. It's so good. Now we can just nestle our squash right there on this sauce. At the last minute, I decided to garnish with some chopped chives. Next, I sprinkled my chopped pistachios over the dish. And finally, in honor of Hades, god of the underworld, I topped it off with a spoonful of pomegranate seeds. And it's ready to serve. I put out some of my favorite skeletal serving dishes, and there you have it. 2 ways to prepare acorn squash. The classic sweet way that makes for a sumptuous side dish or even dessert. And my own crazy concoction that's rich and sweet and salty all at the same time. I can tell you this sauce of mine isn't for the meek, or anyone on a diet for that matter. What I can tell you for a fact is that both of these dishes made from the mysterious acorn squash are absolutely delicious, and more importantly, they are bringing an autumn mood to the Lair of Voltaire as we count down the months to Halloween. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you here next time on Gothic Homemaking.